Mysterious man resembling Jesus appears in the church, and his action changed everyone's life. The snow fell relentlessly over St. Raphael's Church on Christmas Eve, transforming the night into a haunting tableau. Inside, Father Michael Parker stood at the altar, his weathered hands trembling as he read the evening's final notices the church would close its shelter after tonight. Through the frost-covered windows, he glimpsed a figure approaching, tall, bearded, wearing what appeared to be a rain-soaked white robe. The stranger's measured steps left no footprints in the deepening snow. Behind him, the rustling of the homeless seeking warmth in the church's back pews reminded Father Michael of his impossible choice between obedience and compassion. Before we begin this incredible story of faith and redemption at St. Raphael's Church, please take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like button if spiritual miracles move your heart. St. Raphael's Church stood as a century-old sanctuary in downtown Boston, its Gothic spires reaching skyward through the winter gloom. Once a beacon of hope, the church now faced a crisis that threatened its very existence. The heating system struggled against December's bitter cold, and draft whistled through cracked stained glass windows, repairs the church could no longer afford. Father Michael Parker had transformed the church basement into a makeshift shelter 3 winters ago after finding an elderly homeless man frozen to death on the steps. The shelter remained unofficial, operating against the wishes of the wealthy church council led by Richard Bennett. The Archdiocese had sent multiple warnings, but Father Michael couldn't bring himself to turn away those seeking refuge from the cold. Behind the scenes, corruption festered. Church officials had quietly sold off precious artifacts, with funds mysteriously disappearing. Documents regarding property sales showed irregularities, and rumors circulated about plans to sell the historic building to developers. Richard Bennett had already drafted proposals for a luxury shopping complex, though this remained hidden from the congregation. The church's troubles went deeper than finances. Several families had stopped attending after Father Michael's sermons began addressing social justice and wealth inequality. Weekly collections dwindled. The choir loft sat empty most Sundays. Even the traditional Christmas Eve service, once standing room only, now drew barely 50 regular parishioners. Yet St. Raphael's remained vital to the community's poorest members. Besides the shelter, the church ran a soup kitchen and provided emergency assistance to families in crisis. The basement housed a free medical clinic on Wednesdays staffed by volunteer doctors. These services existed on the margins, sustained by Father Michael's determination and a small group of dedicated volunteers who shared his vision of faith in action. As Christmas approached, tensions reached a breaking point. The Archdiocese had issued an ultimatum: close the shelter by New Year's Eve or face closure of the entire church. Father Michael knew his defiance might cost him his position, perhaps even his priesthood. But with temperatures dropping below freezing and shelters citywide already overcrowded, he couldn't abandon those who had nowhere else to go. Sarah Walker knelt in the back pew each evening, clutching the small gold cross that once belonged to her daughter Emily. 9 months had passed since 16-year-old Emily's body was found behind St. Raphael's Church. Her death ruled a tragic accident by authorities despite suspicious circumstances. The community whispered that Sarah was somehow involved, their judgment made harsher by her status as a single mother who worked late shifts at the hospital. Only Father Michael knew her true pain. Emily had discovered financial documents suggesting church fund mismanagement before her death. Thomas Harrison sat in his dimly lit office at the Boston Herald, walls plastered with investigative articles exposing corruption. Once a devoted altar boy at St. Raphael's, he'd become the paper's most cynical reporter. His latest investigation into church property deals had revealed troubling patterns, but editors kept killing the story. Thomas suspected powerful forces at work, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's death and the church's finances were somehow connected. Richard Bennett exuded authority in his tailored suits and corner office overlooking the city. As head of the church council and CEO of Bennett Development, he portrayed himself as a pillar of Catholic virtue. Few knew that his own brother lay in prison for financial fraud, or that Richard had orchestrated his brother's downfall to protect the family name. His plans to transform St. Raphael's into luxury retail space would cement his legacy if he could overcome Father Michael's stubborn resistance to progress. Grace Bennett survived in silence, carrying bruises hidden beneath long sleeves. Richard's imprisoned brother had been her husband, and his abuse remained their family's darkest secret. She volunteered at the church shelter, finding solace among others society had cast aside. Grace recognized something in Sarah Walker's eyes, the same haunted look of someone carrying an unbearable truth. The church's newest figures were its least visible Mary Thompson, an elderly woman who'd lost her home to medical bills, now sleeping in the shelter's warmest corner. James Cooper, a veteran suffering from PTSD, who helped Father Michael maintain the building in exchange for a cot in the basement. And David Chin, a young doctor running the Wednesday clinic despite pressure from his prestigious hospital to distance himself from the controversial church. Father Michael Parker carried his own burdens. 20 years ago, as a young priest, he'd failed to protect a troubled teenager who later took his own life. The boy's father had been a wealthy donor who ensured the incident remained quiet. That shame drove Michael's current defiance. He would not fail those in need again, regardless of the cost. These lives intersected in St. Raphael's shadowed halls, each person guarding secrets that could either save or destroy the church. None of them realized how their fates would intertwine on this snowy Christmas Eve, or that the mysterious stranger approaching through the storm would force every hidden truth into the light. The congregation itself stood divided, wealthy parishioners who shared Richard's vision of progress versus those who depended on the church's charity. Between them wavered the uncertain middle families who'd attended for generations, now unsure where faith ended and politics began. As snow continued falling on Christmas Eve, these forces gathered for what many believed would be St. Raphael's final holiday service. None suspected that before midnight, every certainty would be challenged, every secret exposed, and the very nature of faith and redemption would be tested in ways none could imagine. The evening mass began as heavy snow muffled the city's sounds. Candles flickered against dark and stained glass, their light reflecting off empty pews where wealthy families once sat. Father Michael's voice carried through the cavernous space, speaking of divine mercy while homeless parishioners huddled in back rows, their worn coats and weary faces a testament to worldly indifference. Richard Bennett sat prominently in the front row, his expensive wool coat a stark contrast to the surroundings. His phone buzzed silently, another message from developers eager to begin demolition after New Year's. He smiled, imagining modern shops replacing these deteriorating walls. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, cold air extinguishing several candles. The mysterious figure entered, his white robe now covered in snow, his beard and long hair wet from the storm. His bare feet left wet prints on the stone floor, each step echoing like a judge's gavel. Sarah Walker gasped audibly. Something about the stranger's appearance struck her deeply. He shared an unsettling resemblance to the homeless man found dead on the church steps last winter, the incident that had prompted Father Michael to open the shelter. The stranger moved slowly up the center aisle, stopping at Emily's former favorite pew. Richard Bennett stood abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "This is a private service," he announced, gesturing to his security guard. "Remove this vagrant." But before anyone could move, the stranger spoke, his voice carrying an authority that froze everyone in place. "Is this how you welcome those who hunger and thirst for righteousness?" Richard Bennett. Father Michael stepped down from the pulpit, recognition dawning in his eyes. The stranger's words echoed those of the homeless man who had died, words only Michael had heard in confession. The congregation erupted in whispers. Grace Bennett clutched her prayer book tightly, tears streaming down her face. Thomas Harrison pulled out his reporter's notebook, hand trembling as he wrote. The homeless attendees in the back straightened, as if finding dignity in this moment. "How dare you interrupt," Richard began, but the stranger raised his hand, silencing him with a gesture. "I come not to interrupt, but to reveal," the man said, his eyes sweeping the congregation. "Tonight, all that is hidden will be brought to light." Thunder cracked outside, though the weather report had predicted only snow. The electric lights flickered and failed, leaving only candlelight. In this ghostly illumination, the stranger's shadow seemed to stretch impossibly across the walls, reaching toward the altar where Father Michael stood transfixed. The security guard reached for the stranger, but his hand passed through empty air. The man remained solid, present, yet somehow untouchable. A child in the congregation began to cry, the sound piercing the tense silence. This was the moment everything changed at St. Raphael's Church, though none present yet understood how completely their lives would be transformed before Christmas morning dawned. "John Miller," Father Michael whispered, his voice trembling. The congregation turned to him in confusion. That was his name, the homeless veteran who died on our steps last winter when we were forced to lock our doors. The stranger smiled gently, nodding. "You remembered, Michael. Few others did." Sarah Walker stood suddenly, her gold cross gleaming. "I know you," she said. "You were with Emily that night. She wrote about you in her diary, the man who warned her about the missing church funds." Richard Bennett's face drained of color. The stranger turned his penetrating gaze toward him, causing the proud businessman to grip his pew for support. At that moment, the candles throughout the church began to flicker in unison, their flames growing taller, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped dramatically, breath visible in the air, despite the heating system's steady hum. Thomas Harrison, ever the skeptic, pulled out his phone to record but found it dead, along with every other electronic device in the building. "This is impossible," he muttered, though his journalist's instincts told him he was witnessing something extraordinary. Dr. Chen stepped forward from his position near the homeless parishioners. "I certified John Miller's death certificate myself," he said quietly. "Hypothermia. We could have prevented it." The stranger raised his hands, and suddenly the back wall of the church seemed to shimmer like water. Images began to appear, Emily Walker discovering documents in the church office, John Miller huddled against the locked church doors in the bitter cold, Grace Bennett covering bruises with makeup in a church bathroom. "Stop this," Richard Bennett shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. "The truth cannot be stopped," Richard the stranger replied calmly, "just as you couldn't stop your brother's confession letter from reaching Grace." Grace gasped, clutching her chest. The letter she'd received that morning, still unopened in her purse, suddenly felt heavy as lead. The homeless parishioners in the back began to sing softly an old hymn about redemption that slowly filled the church with haunting harmony. One by one, candles throughout the church extinguished themselves, until only the light around the stranger remained. "Tonight," he announced, his voice resonating with otherworldly authority, "St. Raphael's will witness 3 miracles. The first has already begun, the miracle of truth revealed. The second will be the miracle of justice restored. The third," he paused, looking directly at Father Michael, "will be the miracle of faith reborn." Thunder crashed again outside, and when the echo faded, the stranger had moved to the altar, though no one saw him walk there. The golden cross behind him seemed to pulse with inner light, and the temperature dropped further still. The stage was set. In the next few hours, every soul in St. Raphael's Church would face their deepest truths, their darkest secrets, and their chance at redemption. The night of miracles had only just begun. This brave soul deserves just one click of the like button for revealing the hidden truths that could save St. Raphael's Church. Yet somehow that small act of recognition remains undone. Could you be the one to change that? Such profound courage deserves at least one like, yet somehow that simple gesture of support remains undone. Will you be the first? The stranger's voice filled St. Raphael's Church with quiet authority. Emily Walker did not die by accident, he announced, causing Sarah to collapse into her pew with a cry of anguish. she discovered the truth about missing funds money meant for the homeless shelter diverted to private accounts. Images continued flickering on the church walls, Emily photographing documents with her phone, her confrontation with someone whose face remained in shadow, her final desperate run through the church garden. Your own security team, Richard the stranger continued, turning to Bennett. They chased her that night, not to harm, only to take her phone. But fear and ice are a deadly combination. Richard Bennett stood rigidly, his composure cracking. You can't prove any of this. Thomas Harrison's pen flew across his notebook. But I can, he interjected. Emily sent me copies of those documents the night she died. I've been building the case for months. Father Michael stepped forward, his voice heavy with realization. The security cameras, they were disabled that night for maintenance on your orders, Richard. Grace Bennett suddenly walked to the center aisle, her hand shaking as she opened the letter from her imprisoned husband. Reading aloud, her voice grew stronger with each word. I confess that Richard orchestrated the entire fraud scheme. He set me up to take the fall when Emily Walker threatened to expose everything. I can no longer carry this guilt. The stranger nodded slowly. The first miracle begins, truth long buried, now unearthed. Richard lunged toward his sister-in-law, but found himself frozen in place. The stranger's gaze held him immobile as more revelations poured forth. Dr. Chin spoke next the night John Miller died. I received a call ordering me to delay responding to any emergencies at the church. The call came from your office, Mr. Bennett. The homeless parishioners began sharing their own stories of being offered money to leave the shelter, of threats when they refused, of systematic efforts to empty the church of its undesirable elements. Father Michael's shoulders sagged under the weight of each revelation. I suspected, he whispered. But I was afraid of losing the church entirely if I fought too hard. Fear, the stranger said gently, is the enemy of faith, but not of truth. Thunder cracked again outside, and snow pressed against the windows with increasing urgency. The stranger raised his hands, and suddenly every candle in the church blazed brilliantly, illuminating tear-streaked faces and trembling hands. This is only the beginning, he announced. By midnight all will be revealed. Those who seek forgiveness shall find it. Those who cling to deception will face justice, both divine and earthly. Sarah Walker stood, clutching her daughter's cross. Emily, she cried out. My beautiful Emily was trying to protect the shelter. All this time I thought I blamed myself. The stranger moved to her side, though again no one saw him walk. Your daughter died defending the powerless, he said softly. Her truth will save this church. Richard Bennett's security guard quietly slipped toward the door, but found it frozen shut. No one would leave St. Raphael's tonight, not until every secret was exposed, every sin confronted, every soul given its chance at redemption. The first revelation had shaken the congregation to its core, but as the stranger's words echoed through the candlelit church, all present sensed that far greater miracles and far darker truths still awaited. This powerful moment of truth deserves at least one like. Will you show your support for justice with a simple click? The revelation sparked immediate chaos within St. Raphael's sacred walls. The congregation split into factions, their shouts echoing off ancient stones. Richard Bennett's supporters, mostly wealthy parishioners, gathered around him defensively. This is absurd, called out Margaret Thompson, head of the Ladies' Auxiliary. Richard Bennett has donated millions to this church. Are we believing of vagrants' ghost stories now? But others rallied behind Sarah Walker. The homeless residents formed a protective circle around her, led by James Cooper, the veteran who helped maintain the church. Emily used to bring us coffee every morning, he declared, voice breaking. She was the only one who learned all our names. Father Michael raised his hands for silence, but his authority had been shaken. Please, on this holy night. Holy Richard Bennett's laugh was bitter. You've turned this sacred place into a flophouse, Michael. The archdiocese should have removed you years ago. He pulled out his phone, presumably to call his lawyers, but found it still dead. Grace Bennett stood apart from both groups, her husband's confession letter clutched to her chest. All those years, she whispered, while Richard played the devoted brother, protecting the family name. He was destroying his own flesh and blood. The stranger observed silently as the divide deepened. Even families split apart, children moving to stand with Sarah while parents remained with Richard, elderly couples separating to different sides of the aisle, friendships fracturing in real time. Thomas Harrison moved through the chaos, recording everything in his notebook. The church's financial records, he announced loudly, show over $3 million marked for shelter renovations, money that disappeared into offshore accounts. "Those records are confidential," Richard shouted. "The truth cannot be confidential," the stranger finally spoke. His voice cut through the tumult like a blade, just as pain cannot be hidden forever. As if on cue, the walls began displaying new images, years of secret meetings, shredded documents, whispered threats to those who questioned missing funds. The evidence was overwhelming, yet somehow not legally admissible, a divine revelation that would require human courage to bring to justice. Dr. Chen stepped forward again, addressing his fellow parishioners. "I've treated the homeless in our shelter for 2 years. They're not vagrants, they're our neighbors, our former co-workers, our veterans. Where is our Christian charity?" "Charity," Richard countered. "This church is dying because of charity. Another year of this and there won't be anything left to save." The stranger's next words fell like snow in the silence. "What profits a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul?" The division was complete now. 2 groups stood facing each other across the center aisle, separated by more than just physical space. Between them stood Father Michael, torn between his vows to the church hierarchy and his commitment to true Christian service. And through it all, the winter storm intensified outside, sealing them all within St. Raphael's walls. No one could leave until this conflict reached its resolution, until truth and justice prevailed or darkness triumphed. The stranger moved to the altar, his presence somehow both gentle and terrifying. "The second miracle approaches," he announced. "But first, each of you must choose, stand with truth or fall with lies. There can be no middle ground tonight. If you believe in justice and truth, this revelation deserves your support. Show it with a simple like, 'Will you be the one?'" Thomas Harrison's journalistic instincts kicked in as he pieced together the mounting evidence. Moving between the divided groups, he began connecting threads that had eluded him for months. "Emily discovered something bigger than just missing shelter funds," he announced, flipping through his notebook. "Look at these dates. Every major withdrawal coincided with a property sale by the archdiocese, properties that were drastically undervalued." Sarah Walker pulled out Emily's diary with trembling hands. "December 15th, she read aloud. Found proof today. The church sales are fake. Money's being laundered through offshore accounts. Mr. B thinks nobody checks the basement archives, but I did." The stranger nodded solemnly. "The basement archives, where Emily spent her last night alive." Dr. Chen suddenly spoke up. "I remember that night. I was working late at the clinic when I heard running footsteps. I thought it was just homeless folks coming in from the cold." As he spoke, the church walls flickered with new images. Emily in the basement, frantically photographing documents. Security cameras clicking off one by one. Dark figures moving through shadowed corridors. Grace Bennett unfolded another paper from her purse, bank statement she'd found in her husband's prison belongings. These transfers, she said, matching them to Harrison's notes. They aligned perfectly with the property sales. Richard was using my husband's accounts. "Lies," Richard thundered. "You have no proof." But Father Michael was already moving toward the basement door. "The archives," he said, "they're still down there. Emily must have left something." "The basement's flooded," Richard said quickly. "Has been for months. Any papers would be destroyed." The stranger's smile was knowing. Are you certain about that, Richard? James Cooper, the veteran handyman, stepped forward. No, sir, it's not flooded. I was down there yesterday fixing the furnace. Dry as a bone. Sarah's eyes widened. You kept us away from the basement. All this time. Thomas Harrison was already heading for the basement stairs, followed by Dr. Chin and several others. Richard moved to block them, but found himself once again frozen by the stranger's gaze. Your security team, the stranger spoke softly. The ones who chased Emily that night. Where are they now, Richard? Gone, James Cooper answered. All three quit suddenly last month. Moved out of state, I heard. With generous severance packages, Thomas added, consulting his notes. Paid from the same offshore accounts. The walls now showed Emily's final moments running through the church garden, clutching her phone. The security team pursuing her, not intending harm but desperate to retrieve the evidence. The patch of ice, the fatal fall. We didn't mean to. Richard's voice cracked slightly. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Sarah Walker collapsed into Grace Bennett's arms, both women weeping as the full truth of Emily's death emerged. Father Michael returned from the basement, carrying a sealed envelope. Found this behind the furnace, he said. Addressed to Thomas Harrison in Emily's handwriting. The stranger nodded. The second miracle begins. Emily's final message preserved against all odds. Thomas opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were a USB drive and a letter. As he read Emily's words aloud, the church fell into stunned silence. Dear Mr. Harrison, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. Everything you need is on this drive, proof of years of fraud, money laundering, and corruption. Mr. Bennett didn't just steal from the shelter. He's been helping corrupt church officials hide millions in illegal property deals. They're planning to close churches across the city, sell them at low prices to shell companies, then flip them for massive profits. St. Raphael's is next. Please don't let them destroy this place. It's the only home some people have left. The letter trailed off abruptly, presumably written moments before her final flight through the garden. Richard Bennett sank into a pew, his facade finally cracking. But before anyone could move, the stranger spoke again. The truth is revealed, but justice is not yet complete. There are darker secrets still buried, and midnight approaches. This brave young girl's final message deserves alike to honor her sacrifice. Will you be the one to show your support? The temperature inside St. Raphael's dropped further as the storm intensified. Richard Bennett sat alone now, abandoned by his supporters as evidence of his crimes mounted, but his expression had changed from defeat to something darker, a man with nothing left to lose. You think you know everything, he suddenly laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. Emily's death was tragic, yes. The fraud, the corruption, I admit it all. But you haven't asked the most important question: why this church? Why St. Raphael's? Father Michael stepped forward. What do you mean? Tell them, Michael Richards sneered. Tell them about the boy. The one who died 20 years ago. The one whose father paid you to keep quiet. The stranger's eyes turned to Father Michael, who staggered as if struck. How? How did you know? My father was the donor who buried that scandal Richard revealed. The same father who made me promise on his deathbed to tear this place down. Because his son died here in this basement while the church turned a blind eye. The revelation hit the congregation like a physical blow. Father Michael's face had gone ashen. I was young. Afraid. The boy was troubled, but I should have done more. That troubled boy was my brother Richard's voice cracked. Not the one in prison, our youngest brother. The family shame hidden away, forgotten, until he sought help here and found only judgment. The walls flickered again, showing a teenage boy alone in the church basement. But this time the stranger raised his hand, stopping the images. Enough. The past cannot be changed, only redeemed. Dr. Chin suddenly called out from the basement stairs, "There's something else down here. Hidden room behind the furnace." Richard lunged to his feet, but James Cooper and two other men restrained him. Thomas Harrison and Dr. Chin emerged from the basement, carrying a stack of leather-bound journals. "Parish records," Thomas explained, opening one, "going back decades. And look, pages torn out, exactly when that boy died." Grace Bennett was reading her husband's letter again, eyes widening. "It's all connected," she whispered. "The fraud, Emily's death, the missing boy. Richard wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically destroying evidence of the church's past sins." The stranger's voice filled the church. "Corruption feeds on silence. One sin hidden begets another until darkness covers all." Sarah Walker stood shakily. "Emily died because she discovered both truths, the financial fraud and the covered-up death. That's why it couldn't be just a robbery. That's why she had to be silenced." Thunder cracked overhead as Father Michael fell to his knees. "I should have spoken up 20 years ago. All of this. It's my fault." "No," the stranger said gently. "The fault lies with many. The miracle of redemption awaits all who seek it. But first, the final truth must be told." Richard Bennett had gone very still. "You want the final truth? Check the garden. Under the old oak tree, where Emily fell. Dig there and you'll understand everything." James Cooper and Dr. Chin rushed outside with shovels, despite the howling storm. The congregation waited in tense silence, prayers and fears mingling in the candlelit air. Minutes later, Dr. Chin burst back through the doors, snow coating his clothes. His face was pale as death. "We found something," he gasped. "But it's not just Emily's evidence. There are bones, small bones, from 20 years ago." The stranger's eyes blazed with ethereal light. "Midnight approaches. The third miracle awaits, but first justice must be served, both for the sins of yesterday and the sins of today." As if in response, police sirens became audible in the distance, growing closer despite the storm. If this shocking revelation moved you, honor these victims with a simple like. Their truth deserves to be heard. The police sirens grew closer as tension inside St. Raphael's reached a breaking point. Richard Bennett stood calmly now, a bitter smile playing across his face. "You still don't see the whole picture," he said. "Those bones? My brother didn't die by suicide. He was murdered by the same priest who covered it up. The same priest who stands before you now." All eyes turned to Father Michael, who had gone deathly pale. The stranger remained silent, watching. "No," Father Michael whispered. "I found him there. I was too late." "Lies," Richard roared. "You killed him because he threatened to expose the church's corruption that existed even then. My father didn't pay you to hide a suicide. He paid you to hide a murder." Thomas Harrison flipped frantically through the recovered journals. "Wait, these entries. They're in different handwriting. Some are Father Michael's, but others." Where mine came a new voice. Cardinal Douglas Thompson stood in the doorway, snow-coating his elegant robes. "I've been watching this church for hours, waiting to see how this would unfold. But I can't let this deception continue." The stranger's eyes narrowed as the cardinal walked down the center aisle. Police lights now flashed through the stained glass windows, casting red and blue shadows across shocked faces. "Richard," the cardinal said softly, "your brother's death was indeed murder. But Father Michael didn't kill him. I did." The confession fell like a thunderbolt in the stunned silence. "The boy discovered financial records from the 1990s, proof of decades of systematic corruption. Your father didn't pay to hide his son's suicide. He paid to protect the church's reputation. Father Michael took the blame, carried that cross for 20 years. Thinking he had failed to prevent a suicide, he never knew the truth." Richard Bennett staggered, grabbing a pew for support. But why frame Michael? Why continue the corruption?" because weak men in positions of power will do anything to keep it. The stranger spoke, his voice heavy with divine judgment. Just as you did, Richard, when Emily discovered your modern version of the same sins. The police were at the doors now, but they remained mysteriously locked, despite their efforts to enter. 20 years, Father Michael breathed. 20 years I've carried that guilt. Grace Bennett suddenly stepped forward, her voice strong. Emily knew. That's what the evidence on her phone really showed, not just current fraud, but proof linking today's corruption directly back to that boy's death. She found the connection everyone missed. Sarah Walker pulled out her daughter's diary again. December 20th, she read, connected the dots. It goes back 20 years. Poor Father Michael's been blamed all this time. Have to make this right. The stranger raised his hands, and suddenly every candle in the church blazed white hot. Midnight approaches. The time of judgment is here. But first, each soul must choose confession or damnation, truth or lies, redemption or justice. Cardinal Thompson reached into his robes, pulling out a gun. No, I won't let decades of careful work be undone by a ghost and a dead girl's diary. The homeless parishioners formed a human shield in front of Sarah Walker. James Cooper moved to protect Father Michael. Dr. Chen edged toward the basement, where the evidence lay. Richard Bennett stood frozen, decades of revenge plots crumbling around him. Your brother forgave Father Michael before he died, the stranger revealed to Richard. His last confession heard only by divine ears. He knew who really killed him. And Emily, her last thoughts were not of fear, but of hope that the truth would finally be revealed. Thunder crashed directly overhead as midnight drew near. The cardinal's hand trembled on the gun. Choose, the stranger commanded, his voice filling every corner of the church. The third miracle awaits, but first justice must be served. The truth must be spoken. The sins must be confronted. Police continued battering at the doors as Cardinal Thompson raised his gun, tears streaming down his face. But before he could choose his final act, a new sound cut through the chaos, a child's voice, singing the first pure notes of Silent Night. If this moment of truth touched your heart, let's honor these brave souls with a like. Every click represents a stand for justice. The child's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, pure and haunting. As the song continued, the stranger's appearance began to change. His ragged robes transformed into a familiar church maintenance uniform, the same one John Miller had worn during his brief time as Saint Raphael's handyman. I was here all along, the stranger said, his voice now recognizable as John Miller's. Even after death, I couldn't leave. Not while Emily's killers walked free. Not while the church's secrets remained buried. Cardinal Thompson's gun hand shook violently. The homeless man, you were investigating us even then. I was FBI John Miller revealed. Undercover, investigating church corruption. Emily discovered my true identity the night she died. She was bringing evidence to me when they chased her into the garden. Richard Bennett collapsed into a pew, laughing hysterically. A federal agent, posing as a homeless veteran. And we let him freeze to death on the steps. The child's voice grew stronger, joined by other ethereal voices, the souls of all those the church had failed over the years. The sound wrapped around Cardinal Thompson, who slowly lowered his gun. Emily wasn't running from your security team that night, John's spirit continued. She was running from the Cardinal's men. She had proof linking both cases, your brother's murder and the current fraud. The Cardinal couldn't risk another death being traced to him. Father Michael stepped forward, realization dawning. The security cameras, they weren't disabled for maintenance. There were two teams in the church that night. Richard's men trying to retrieve evidence of financial fraud, and my men, Cardinal Thompson, finished, ensuring no one discovered a 20-year-old murder. When the girl fell, both teams fled, each thinking the other was responsible. Sarah Walker's cry of anguish pierced the chorus of ghostly voices. My daughter died because of a corrupt cardinal's fear and a vengeful man's greed. The third miracle approaches, John Miller's spirit announced. But first, one more truth must be revealed. He turned to Richard Bennett. Your brother's last confession. He forgave more than just Father Michael. He forgave you, Richard. Me, Richard whispered. For not believing him when he first reported the abuse he witnessed in the church. For choosing the family's reputation over his safety. His death drove you to seek revenge on the church. But your revenge only perpetuated the cycle of corruption he died trying to expose. The police battering at the doors grew louder as midnight drew closer. Cardinal Thompson looked at his gun, then placed it on the altar. I confess, he said quietly, to the murder of Peter Bennett 20 years ago, to the cover-up, to ordering my men to silence Emily Walker. I confess it all. Richard Bennett stood shakily. And I confess to using my brother's death as an excuse to continue the very corruption he fought against, to letting an innocent girl die rather than face the truth. The stranger, John Miller's spirit, nodded solemnly. The first two miracles are complete truth revealed and justice prepared. Now, as midnight strikes, the third miracle begins. The child's voice reached a crystal-clear crescendo as the church bells began to toll. With each strike, more spirits became visible. Peter Bennett, young and at peace. Emily Walker, smiling at her mother. The countless homeless souls who had died on winter streets while the church's wealth was squandered. The third miracle, John Miller announced, is not for the dead, but for the living. The miracle of redemption through confession, of healing through truth, of faith reborn through justice. As the 12th bell tolled, the doors burst open. But it wasn't just the police who entered. Behind them came news crews, FBI agents, and most surprisingly, the Pope's personal investigator, sent months ago when the Vatican first suspected corruption in the American Church. We've been building this case for years, the FBI commander announced. Tonight, we finally have the confessions we needed. The Pope's investigator stepped forward, his eyes on the fading spirits. The church has failed many, he said solemnly. But tonight, by God's grace, we begin to make it right. If this story of faith, justice, and redemption touched your soul, consider joining our spiritual journey. Subscribe to experience more profound tales of divine intervention and human transformation. Together, we'll explore the miracles that remind us of God's endless grace and mercy in our lives. If this story has touched your heart, join our spiritual journey by subscribing. Together, we'll witness more miraculous tales of faith, redemption, and divine justice. The subsequent hours brought a wave of personal reckonings. As Cardinal Thompson and Richard Bennett were led away in handcuffs, the true cost of decades of corruption began to surface. Sarah Walker sat in Emily's favorite pew, surrounded by her daughter's evidence and diary. She died a hero, Dr. Chin said softly, sitting beside her. Her sacrifice exposed decades of corruption and may save countless lives. But I blamed her, Sarah whispered, tears flowing. When rumors spread about drugs, about her running away, I actually believed them, my own daughter, and I doubted her. Grace Bennett faced her own harsh truths as FBI agents reviewed her husband's full confession. Her years of silent suffering, of protecting the Bennett family's reputation, had inadvertently helped conceal greater crimes. Your husband's testimony will be crucial, the FBI agent told her gently. His detailed records of Richard's financial schemes, combined with Emily's evidence, could help recover millions in stolen funds. Father Michael sat alone in the confessional, his shoulders shaking with sobs. 20 years of misplaced guilt had shaped his every action, driving him to protect the vulnerable at all costs. Now, knowing he had been an unwitting pawn rather than a failed protector, he struggled to reconcile his past with the truth. James Cooper, the veteran handyman, revealed his own painful connection. John Miller wasn't just FBI, he admitted to the investigators. He was my former commanding officer. When he went undercover, he asked me to maintain my homeless veteran cover story to help watch the church. I watched him die on those steps, unable to break my cover. The homeless parishioners faced uncertainty as news crews swarmed the church. Their sanctuary would likely close temporarily during the investigation. Yet many community members, moved by the night's revelation, stepped forward to offer temporary housing. Dr. Chin confronted his hospital's board members, who had arrived to manage the publicity situation. He resigned on the spot, announcing plans to open a full-time clinic for the homeless. Emily's evidence exposed more than church corruption, he declared. It showed how many institutions failed our most vulnerable. Thomas Harrison struggled with his own role as he wrote the story that would shake the Catholic Church to its foundations. I could have dug deeper, he confessed to Sarah. When Emily first contacted me, I dismissed her as just another teenager with conspiracy theories. If I'd listened sooner. The Pope's investigator, reviewing the evidence, made a devastating announcement. Similar patterns of corruption had been found in churches across the country. St. Raphael's was just the tip of the iceberg. But perhaps the heaviest cost fell on Richard Bennett's teenage son, Mark, who arrived at the church near dawn. Learning that his uncle's death had driven his father's descent into corruption, and that his father had then contributed to Emily's death, the boy's faith in his family and in God seemed shattered. "How do you believe in anything again?" he asked Father Michael, his young voice breaking, "when everything you thought was good turns out to be built on lies?" The spirit of John Miller appeared one last time, visible now only to those who truly needed guidance. "Faith isn't about believing in perfection," he said softly to the boy. "It's about believing in redemption. This moment of healing and redemption deserves your support. Join our spiritual community by subscribing to witness more powerful stories of faith." As dawn approached, St. Raphael's faced an immediate crisis. FBI agents had sealed off the basement as a crime scene. News vans clogged the streets despite the continuing snow. The Archdiocese announced an emergency meeting to discuss the church's future. "They'll close us for sure now," James Cooper said grimly. "With the cardinal arrested and evidence of long-term corruption, they'll want to erase everything." The homeless parishioners gathered their meager belongings, preparing for eviction. Despite community offers of help, many feared returning to the streets. Winter shelters were already overcrowded. Father Michael stood at the altar, watching his life's work seemingly crumble. The Pope's investigator approached him with a grave expression. "The Vatican will need to make an example," he said quietly. "The publicity alone. There's pressure to demolish the church, to show we're truly breaking with the past." Sarah Walker suddenly stood. "No," she declared firmly. "Emily died protecting this place. We won't let her sacrifice be in vain." Dr. Chin joined her. "This church is more than a building. It's the last safety net for hundreds of people. Closing it condemns them to the streets." But the crisis deepened as city officials arrived with condemned notices. The building's code violations, long overlooked, were now liability issues. The prosecutor's office wanted the entire property preserved as evidence. The remaining parishioners formed a human chain around the church. News cameras captured the emotional standoff, homeless individuals linking arms with wealthy congregants, united in protecting their spiritual home. Thomas Harrison's live coverage went viral. The same church that harbored corruption also sheltered the innocent. Should the sins of the few condemn the sanctuary of the many? Grace Bennett made a shocking announcement. "I'm donating my husband's seized assets, my legal share, to save this church. Let the money stolen through corruption fund its redemption." Yet opposition mounted. Other churches feared investigation, pressuring the Archdiocese to distance itself completely. Property developers sensed opportunity in the scandal, offering clean slate solutions that involved demolition. The Pope's investigator received urgent calls from Rome. The Vatican wanted swift resolution to contain the scandal. Police began moving in to break up the human chain. Just then, Mark Bennett, Richard's son, stepped forward. News cameras focused on the teenager as he addressed the crowd. My father destroyed lives protecting this church's dark secrets. But Emily Walker died protecting its true purpose, helping those in need. Which legacy will we choose to honor? Father Michael watched the confrontation escalate, remembering John Miller's words about redemption. He had a choice: accept the church's closure as penance for past sins, or fight to preserve its future mission. The spirit of John Miller appeared one final time, visible now to all. The third miracle isn't complete, he announced. Redemption requires more than exposing truth or achieving justice. It requires choosing what rises from the ashes of the past. As tensions peaked, a solution emerged from an unexpected source. But first, the community would face its greatest test of faith yet. The church bells tolled 6 a.m. on Christmas morning. The next few hours would determine not just St. Raphael's fate, but the future of faith itself in a community shaken to its core. This powerful moment of community unity deserves your support. Subscribe to witness more stories of faith triumphing over adversity. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, a black limousine pulled up to St. Raphael's. The driver opened the door, and gasps rippled through the crowd as Peter Bennett, Richard's supposedly murdered brother, stepped out, very much alive. "I apologize for the deception," he said, addressing the stunned onlookers, "but it was necessary to expose the full scope of corruption." The Pope's investigator stepped forward. Peter Bennett didn't die 20 years ago. The Vatican's secret investigation unit faked his death and placed him in protective custody. He's been working undercover ever since, helping us track church corruption across the globe. Father Michael staggered, supported by Dr. Chin. "The bones in the garden." "A clever plant," Peter explained, "staged to force confessions from both my brother and the Cardinal. The FBI has been working with the Vatican for years, building this case. John Miller was part of our team." Sarah Walker pushed through the crowd. "Did Emily know? Was she part of this?" Peter's face filled with regret. "No, Emily stumbled onto our investigation by accident. Her death was tragically real and it almost compromised everything. But in the end, her courage helped us achieve what 20 years of undercover work couldn't." The news crews surged forward as Peter revealed documents proving an even larger conspiracy. The corruption extended far beyond St. Raphael's, reaching into the highest levels of church hierarchy. "My brother Richard wasn't just seeking revenge for my supposed death," Peter continued. "He was unknowingly helping us track money laundering operations through church property sales. His guilt over failing me made him the perfect unwitting agent." The Pope's investigator addressed the crowd. The Vatican didn't want to merely expose corruption in one church. We needed to uncover the entire network. Peter Bennett's death created a chain reaction that finally brought everything to light. Grace Bennett stood trembling. "My husband, your other brother, is being released today," Peter said gently. "His confession was part of our operation. He agreed to take a fall temporarily to help us gather evidence. The abuse you suffered was real, Grace, and unforgivable. But he's been working with us to make amends." James Cooper suddenly laughed. "John Miller knew, didn't he? That's why he appeared as a spirit to keep us all here until Peter could arrive with the evidence." "John's death was also tragically real," Peter said solemnly. "He sacrificed himself to maintain his cover. But his spirit, that was something none of us planned. A true Christmas miracle." As the implications of these revelations spread through the crowd, Father Michael approached Peter. 20 years of guilt," he said quietly. "You let me believe." "I'm sorry, Michael," Peter replied. "Your genuine remorse over my supposed death made the deception convincing. The corrupt officials never suspected you because your pain was real. Can you forgive me?" The spirit of John Miller appeared one final time, standing between them. "The third miracle is not just about redemption," he said. It's about understanding that God's justice works in mysterious ways. Sometimes what seems like a sin is part of a greater purpose. But as the crowd tried to process these revelations, an even more shocking truth emerged, one that would transform not just St. Raphael's, but the entire understanding of faith and justice in their community. If you believe in divine justice and miraculous revelations, join our spiritual community by subscribing. Let's witness more moments of faith together. As the morning sun pierced through the stained glass windows, Peter Bennett revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Reaching into his briefcase, he withdrew a letter bearing the Vatican seal. By order of His Holiness, he read, St. Raphael's Church will become a pilot program, the first fully transparent, community-governed parish in America. All financial decisions will be made by a council that must include representatives from the homeless community. But before the celebration could begin, Emily's spirit appeared alongside John Miller's, visible to all. Her presence brought the crowd to reverent silence. The corruption you exposed wasn't just about money, Emily's spirit said softly. It was about power. About who gets to decide what faith looks like, who deserves sanctuary, who belongs. Sarah Walker stepped forward, finally understanding. That's why you were so determined to protect the shelter, wasn't you, sweetheart? You saw that true faith happens in how we treat the least among us. Father Michael removed his collar and placed it on the altar. I've worn this as a symbol of authority, he said, but true spiritual authority comes from service, not power. Peter Bennett nodded. The Vatican agrees. This church will pioneer a new model of faith community, one where the boundaries between priest and parishioner, wealthy and poor, all dissolve into simple Christian service. The Pope's investigator added, His Holiness believes the church must return to its roots when early Christians shared all they had, when sanctuary meant more than just a building. Grace Bennett, standing with her newly freed husband, made an announcement: we're donating the entire Bennett estate. Half to support St. Raphael's new mission, half to establish shelters at other churches across the city. Thomas Harrison, still taking notes, looked up in awe. So the third miracle is the death of hierarchy. John Miller's spirit finished. The rebirth of true Christian community. Dr. Chen stepped forward with the homeless parishioners. We'll establish a full medical clinic, job training programs, education services, everything people need to rebuild their lives. The spirits of Emily and John Miller began to fade. But before they disappeared, Emily spoke one last time. The greatest miracle isn't the exposure of corruption or even the triumph of justice. It's the reminder that every soul has equal worth in God's eyes. That's what I died protecting. That's what this church must now live to prove. As the spirits vanished, Father Michael picked up his collar again, but instead of putting it back on, he began tearing it into strips. Let anyone who wishes to serve take a piece, he said. Let us all be ministers to each other. The line that formed crossed all social boundaries, homeless and wealthy, young and old, doubters and believers, each taking a fragment of the collar as a commitment to this new way of being church. Peter Bennett watched with tears in his eyes. 20 years ago, I thought exposing corruption would be enough. But Emily showed us that true reform isn't just about ending evil, it's about beginning good. The church bells rang out once more, but this time they seemed to carry a different message, not just marking time, but announcing transformation. The third miracle was complete. But for St. Raphael's Church and its people, the real miracle was just beginning. If this miraculous transformation touched your heart, support our channel by subscribing. Together we'll witness more powerful stories of faith and redemption. 1 year later, St. Raphael's Church stood transformed. The once crumbling building now gleamed, restored not by wealthy donors, but by the community itself. Every repair, every renovation carried the fingerprints of those who had made this place their true home. Sarah Walker headed the new community council, her daughter's diary displayed prominently in a memorial alcove. Emily's evidence didn't just expose corruption, she often said. It created a blueprint for change. The former basement archive had become Emily's place a 24-hour shelter and resource center. Dr. Chin's clinic occupied one wing, while James Cooper ran job training programs in another. Grace Bennett supervised education initiatives, turning her pain into purpose. Cardinal Thompson and Richard Bennett faced justice in federal court, their confessions leading to widespread reforms in church financial oversight. But the true justice came in the transformation of lives. Peter Bennett returned regularly, not as an investigator but as a simple parishioner. He and Father Michael had formed a deep friendship, their shared burden of deception transformed into a mission of transparency. The homeless were no longer merely recipients of charity but full partners in the church's ministry. Many, like James Cooper, had found not just shelter but purpose. The human chain that once protected the building had become a permanent circle of mutual support. Thomas Harrison's ongoing coverage attracted national attention. Other churches began adopting St. Raphael's model, breaking down barriers between clergy and congregation, wealthy and poor. The Pope himself visited, blessing this new vision of church community. In the garden where Emily fell, he dedicated a memorial not just to her, but to all who had suffered from corruption and all who fought to end it. The greatest miracle, Father Michael would say in his sermons, wasn't the exposure of evil but the awakening of good in every heart. Each Christmas Eve, as snow fell on the renewed church, 2 candles burned perpetually, one for John Miller, one for Emily Walker. But they were more than memorials. They were beacons, drawing people from all walks of life to a place where true sanctuary meant more than safety. It meant belonging. The spirits never appeared again, but their presence lingered in every act of kindness, every barrier broken, every life transformed. The mysterious golden cross that had appeared on the floor remained, now inlaid with marble and inscribed with words from Emily's diary. True faith isn't found in power or wealth, but in how we love each other. Every act of kindness is a miracle. Every moment of justice is divine. If this story of transformation and divine justice moved you, join our spiritual family by subscribing. Together, we'll continue to witness miracles of faith. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the miracle, St. Raphael's held a special service. The pews were filled with people from all walks of life, former homeless, now in stable housing, wealthy parishioners who had learned humility, skeptics who had found authentic faith, and seekers drawn by the church's radical transformation. As Father Michael led the service, now dressed in simple clothing like everyone else, snow began falling softly outside. The restored stained glass windows cast rainbow light across the congregation, where Sarah Walker and Grace Bennett sat with their support group for grieving families. Peter Bennett and his restored family, including his once imprisoned brother, joined hands with former homeless residents. Thomas Harrison, who had become a regular member, read from Emily's diary one final time. I used to think miracles meant spectacular events, angels appearing, seas parting, but now I understand. The real miracle is when people choose love over fear, truth over comfort, justice over power. Every time someone stands up for what's right, that's God at work in the world. Dr. Chin's medical clinic had expanded to 3 more churches. James Cooper's job training program had helped hundreds find employment. The Bennett fortune, once built on corruption, now funded similar transformations across the city. The mysterious cross in the floor continued to glow softly during prayer services, a permanent reminder of divine intervention. But the true miracle lived in the changed hearts of the congregation. Father Michael ended the service with words that had become St. Raphael's new motto. We are all broken, all healing, all serving. In our weakness we find strength. In our differences we find unity. In our faith we find not escape from the world's darkness, but the courage to light candles in it. As the congregation sang the final hymn, many swore they caught glimpses of Emily and John Miller smiling among them. The scent of incense mixed with winter air, and the candles flickered with an otherworldly light. The church bells rang out across the snowy city, carrying a message of hope that corruption could be overcome, that wounds could heal, that faith could be reborn, and that every soul, no matter how lost or forgotten, had a place in God's house. St. Raphael's had become more than a church. It was a testament to the power of truth, the strength of community, and the endless possibility of redemption. The miracle that began on one snowy Christmas Eve continued to unfold, touching life after life, proving that divine intervention works not just through supernatural events, but through the transformed hearts and hands of ordinary people who choose to believe in something greater than themselves. The end. If this story touched your heart and strengthened your faith, please share it with others who might need its message of hope and redemption. Dear friends, if this miraculous tale of faith, redemption, and divine justice touched your heart, please support our team by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these powerful spiritual stories. Share this video with your loved ones who might need its message of hope. Every like and share spreads the light of faith further. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. How did this story impact your faith journey? What touched you most deeply? And tell us, would you like to hear part 2 of this extraordinary miracle at St. Raphael's Church? There are still untold stories waiting to be revealed.